Hi guys, tonight we're exploring an incredible power. What if the human mind suddenly developed the ability to physically bend space-time itself? Not through technology, not through machinery, but through pure thought and consciousness alone. If you enjoy these mind power sleep stories that blur the line between consciousness and physics, hit that like button and subscribe for more. And drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. I love seeing where all you night thinkers are checking in from. Alright, let's begin. The morning began like any other for Dr. Elena Vasquez at the European Southern Observatory in Chile's Atacama Desert, where she monitored radio telescopes scanning the cosmos for gravitational waves. But at precisely 11:23 local time, something extraordinary happened that would forever change our understanding of reality itself. The gravitational wave detectors, designed to sense ripples in space-time caused by colliding black holes billions of light-years away, suddenly registered a signal unlike anything in their databases. The wave pattern wasn't coming from the depths of space, but from much closer to home, originating from a small apartment building in downtown Santiago, exactly 247 kilometers to the southwest. What Elena didn't know was that at that exact moment, Marcus Chen, a 28-year-old software engineer suffering from chronic migraines, was experiencing something that defied every law of physics as we understand them. The pain in his head had reached a crescendo that morning, a throbbing agony that felt like his skull might split apart. But instead of his skull fracturing, something far more impossible occurred. The space around Marcus began to bend and warp, creating gravitational distortions that rippled outward at the speed of light, travelling through the Earth's crust and atmosphere until they reached Elena's sensitive instruments 300 kilometers away. This wasn't science fiction anymore. This was the dawn of a new era in human evolution, one where consciousness itself could manipulate the fundamental fabric of reality. Within hours, similar readings began appearing at gravitational wave observatories around the globe. The Laser Interferometer, gravitational wave observatory facilities in Livingston, Louisiana and Hanford, Washington detected corresponding signals. The Virgo detector in Italy registered anomalous readings. Even the Kagra detector buried deep in the mountains of Japan picked up these impossible signatures of bent space-time originating not from cosmic events, but from human minds. The implications were staggering. If human consciousness could bend space, it meant that the boundary between mind and matter was far more porous than anyone had imagined. Within the first week of these discoveries, reports began flooding in from around the world of individuals experiencing what researchers would later term spatial cognitive episodes. A grandmother in Mumbai found herself accidentally teleporting her teacup across the room during an intense emotional moment. A construction worker in Detroit discovered he could compress the space around heavy steel beams, making 1,000-pound girders as light as feathers. A young artist in São Paulo realized she could stretch the interior dimensions of her tiny studio apartment, creating a workspace that was somehow larger inside than the building's exterior dimensions would allow. The scientific community erupted into chaos. Physicists who had spent their careers understanding space and time as fixed, immutable dimensions suddenly found themselves confronting evidence that consciousness could manipulate these fundamental aspects of reality. Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a theoretical physicist at Tokyo University who devoted 30 years to studying general relativity, later described the moment he first witnessed spatial manipulation as watching someone casually rewrite the laws of the universe with their thoughts. The measurements were undeniable. When tested under laboratory conditions, individuals demonstrating these abilities could generate gravitational fields measuring up to 0.003 solar masses concentrated in spaces no larger than a coffee cup. The military implications became apparent almost immediately. Within 72 hours of the first confirmed cases, defense departments across the globe initiated classified research programs. The Pentagon allocated $12 billion to Project Mindwarp, while Russia's Ministry of Defense established the Spatial Cognition Research Division with a budget of 8.4 billion rubles. China's People's Liberation Army created the Strategic Space Manipulation Unit, and the European Union launched the Consciousness Physics Initiative with funding of 15 billion euros. The race was on to weaponize human consciousness itself, but the applications extended far beyond military concerns. Transportation systems around the world ground to a halt as spatial manipulators, as they came to be known, began accidentally creating wormholes during their daily commutes. The London Underground experienced its first dimensional breach on a Tuesday morning when a stressed commuter named James Whitfield, running late for an important meeting, unconsciously compressed the space between King's Cross and Piccadilly Circus, creating a shortcut that reduced the normal 23-minute journey to just 4 minutes. The tunnel he created remained stable for 17 hours before collapsing, during which time over 43,000 passengers used the impossible route. Similar incidents occurred across major metropolitan areas. In New York City, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority recorded 67 spatial anomalies in the subway system during the first month alone. The most dramatic incident occurred when a Manhattan resident named Sarah Rodriguez, devastated by news of her father's illness, unconsciously created a spatial fold that connected her apartment directly to Mount Sinai Hospital, bypassing 42 city blocks and creating a doorway that allowed her to step from her living room directly into the hospital corridor where her father lay recovering from surgery. The economic implications were equally profound. Traditional concepts of distance and transportation, costs became meaningless when space itself could be manipulated. Shipping companies faced bankruptcy as spatial manipulators began offering instant delivery services. Federal Express and UPS stock prices plummeted by 67% in the first month, as entrepreneurs discovered they could compress space to deliver packages across continents in minutes rather than days. A small startup in Silicon Valley called Spatial Solutions, founded by a former Google engineer named David Park who could create stable wormholes up to 5 kilometers in diameter, secured $43 billion in venture capital funding and began offering what they called dimensional shipping services. The energy sector experienced similar disruption. Power companies that had invested trillions of dollars in transmission infrastructure watched their business models collapse as spatial manipulators began creating energy conduits that could transport electricity across continents with zero loss. A wind farm in the North Sea could now power manufacturing facilities in Germany through spatial channels that bypassed thousands of kilometers of transmission lines. Solar installations in the Sahara Desert began providing energy directly to cities in northern Europe through compressed space corridors that reduced the effective distance from 3,000 kilometers to mere meters. Religious institutions grappled with theological implications that challenged fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality and consciousness. The Vatican convened an emergency council of theologians and physicists to examine whether spatial manipulation represented divine intervention or evidence of humanity's inherent connection to creation itself. Buddhist monasteries in Tibet reported that advanced meditation practitioners had been achieving similar feats for centuries, but had kept these abilities secret to prevent their misuse. Hindu scholars pointed to ancient Sanskrit texts describing siddhis, supernatural abilities that included mastery over space and time, suggesting that these phenomena weren't new, but rather forgotten aspects of human potential. The Islamic world saw heated debates among scholars about whether spatial manipulation represented a divine gift or a deviation from natural law. The Al-Azhar University in Cairo established a special commission of religious scholars and physicists to study the theological implications, ultimately concluding that if Allah had granted humans the capacity for spatial manipulation, then developing these abilities was not only permissible, but potentially a spiritual obligation. Meanwhile, the scientific understanding of these abilities continued to evolve. Researchers discovered that spatial manipulation wasn't equally distributed across the population. Approximately 3.7% of humans demonstrated some level of spatial cognitive ability, with only 0.04% showing strong enough effects to generate measurable gravitational waves. The abilities seem to correlate with specific neurological patterns, particularly unusual activity in the posterior parietal cortex and the default mode network of the brain. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, who led the first comprehensive study of spatial manipulators, found that individuals with these abilities showed brain activity patterns that suggested their consciousness was somehow interfacing directly with quantum fields. Brain scans revealed that during spatial manipulation events, the subject's neural networks generated electromagnetic patterns that matched the frequency signatures of gravitational waves. It was as if their thoughts were directly modulating the fundamental forces that hold reality together. The implications for our understanding of consciousness became profound. If minds could bend space, it suggested that consciousness wasn't simply an emergent property of complex neural networks, but rather a fundamental aspect of reality itself, capable of interacting directly with the quantum substrate that underlies all existence. This discovery validated theories that had been considered fringe for decades, including the idea that consciousness played a direct role in quantum mechanics, and that the observer effect in quantum physics wasn't just a measurement problem, but evidence of mind's fundamental connection to reality. Educational systems worldwide scrambled to adapt to this new reality. Universities established departments of spatial psychology, consciousness physics, and dimensional engineering. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology launched a $4 billion research program called the Consciousness Space Interface Initiative, while Stanford University created the world's first PhD program in applied spatial manipulation. High schools began offering courses in spatial awareness and dimensional safety, teaching students how to recognize the early signs of spatial cognitive episodes and how to prevent dangerous accidents. The learning curve was steep and sometimes tragic. Emergency rooms across the globe began treating victims of spatial displacement syndrome, a condition that occurred when inexperienced spatial manipulators accidentally transported parts of themselves through compressed space without bringing their entire body along. The first recorded fatality occurred in Berlin when a 19-year-old university student named Klaus Weber attempted to create a shortcut to his girlfriend's apartment, but miscalculated the spatial coordinates, resulting in a dimensional shear that severed his left arm at the molecular level. The arm materialized perfectly intact in his girlfriend's bedroom, while Klaus collapsed from traumatic amputation in his own dormitory. These incidents led to the establishment of spatial manipulation licensing programs and safety protocols. The International Spacetime Regulatory Commission, hastily formed by the United Nations, issued guidelines requiring all spatial manipulators to undergo a minimum of 200 hours of training before attempting any dimensional alterations. Violation penalties included fines up to $5 million and imprisonment for up to 20 years for unauthorized spatial manipulation that resulted in property damage or injury. Insurance companies faced unprecedented challenges as traditional risk assessment models became obsolete. How do you calculate premiums when a client can accidentally teleport their house into another dimension during a nightmare? Lloyd's of London, the world's most famous insurance market, reported claims exceeding £47 billion in the first year alone, primarily related to spatial displacement incidents. Property insurance rates increased by an average of 312% globally as companies struggled to adapt to a reality where buildings could disappear, merge with other structures, or suddenly find themselves occupying the same physical space as neighbouring properties. The construction industry underwent a complete revolution. Traditional architecture became obsolete when buildings could be larger on the inside than their exterior dimensions suggested. Architects began designing spatially flexible structures that could expand and contract their interior volumes based on occupancy needs. A small office building in downtown Tokyo, designed by renowned architect Hiroshi Yamamoto, could accommodate 50 people in its standard configuration, but expand through spatial manipulation to house over 3,000 employees when needed, all within the same external footprint of just 800 square meters. Urban planning faced similar transformations. Cities that had struggled with overcrowding for centuries suddenly found new possibilities for expansion through dimensional layering. Manhattan real estate developers began constructing depth towers, buildings that extended not upward or outward but inward through compressed space, creating vast interior volumes within structures no larger than traditional brownstones. A single building plot measuring 20 by 30 meters could now house residential complexes accommodating over 2,000 residents through careful spatial manipulation. Transportation infrastructure required complete reimagining. Traditional highways became increasingly obsolete as skilled spatial manipulators could traverse continental distances in minutes through compressed space corridors. The interstate highway system in the United States, built at a cost of over $128 billion in today's currency, saw traffic volumes decrease by 87% within 2 years as spatial transportation became more common and accessible. Airlines faced an existential crisis. Why endure 8-hour flights across the Atlantic when a spatial manipulator could create a temporary corridor between New York and London in just 47 minutes? Commercial aviation stocks lost 93% of their value as passengers abandoned traditional air travel for dimensional transportation services. Boeing and Airbus pivoted their business models, retooling their factories to produce spatial stabilization platforms rather than traditional aircraft. The freight industry experienced similar disruption. Container ships that had carried 68% of global trade suddenly found themselves competing with spatial logistics companies that could transport cargo instantaneously across any distance. The port of Shanghai, which had handled over 47 million 20-foot equivalent units annually, saw container volumes drop by 74% as manufacturers bypassed traditional shipping entirely through spatial transportation networks. International borders became increasingly meaningless when space itself could be folded. Immigration and customs authorities struggled to maintain control, as spatial manipulators could bypass checkpoints entirely by creating dimensional passages that connected one country directly to another. The United States-Mexico border, despite billions of dollars invested in physical barriers and electronic surveillance systems, became effectively porous as spatial corridors allowed unrestricted movement between the two nations. Governments worldwide implemented emergency measures to maintain sovereignty and security. The European Union established the Dimensional Border Control Agency with a budget of €23 billion and a mandate to develop technologies capable of detecting and blocking unauthorized spatial manipulation at international boundaries. The agency recruited over 15,000 specialists trained in spatial awareness and deployed quantum field detectors along all member state borders to identify dimensional breaches in real time. The pharmaceutical industry discovered unexpected applications for spatial manipulation in medical treatment. Surgeons at Johns Hopkins Hospital pioneered techniques using compressed space to perform operations without making traditional incisions. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a cardiac surgeon who possessed strong spatial manipulation abilities, successfully performed the world's first dimensional bypass surgery, creating temporary spatial folds that allowed her to access a patient's heart without opening the chest cavity. The procedure reduced surgical trauma by 94% and cut recovery time from 6 weeks to just 8 days. Cancer treatment saw revolutionary advances as oncologists learned to use spatial manipulation to isolate and extract tumors through dimensional separation. The technique involved creating microscopic spatial folds that surrounded cancerous tissue, allowing surgeons to remove malignant cells by folding them out of the patient's body and into separate dimensional pockets. The Mayo Clinic reported success rates of 98.7% for early-stage cancers treated through spatial extraction methods, compared to traditional treatment success rates of 73%. Mental health professionals encountered entirely new categories of psychological disorders related to spatial manipulation abilities. Dimensional dissociation disorder emerged as individuals struggled to maintain coherent relationships with physical reality when they could alter space at will. Dr. Patricia Kim, a psychiatrist at the University of California, San Francisco, documented cases of spatial manipulators who became trapped in recursive dimensional loops, creating endless nested spaces that reflected their internal psychological states. One patient, a software programmer named Robert Chen, accidentally created a spatial anomaly in his apartment that contained over 4,000 interconnected rooms, each reflecting a different aspect of his anxiety and depression. The phenomenon also revealed the intimate connection between emotional states and spatial manipulation abilities. Researchers discovered that intense emotions, particularly fear, anger, and grief, dramatically amplified spatial cognitive effects. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the astronomer who first detected the gravitational wave signatures, later joined a research team studying the emotional triggers of spatial manipulation. Their work revealed that individuals experiencing acute psychological distress could generate gravitational fields up to 17 times stronger than their baseline levels. This emotional connection led to the development of dimensional therapy, treatment approaches that used controlled spatial manipulation exercises to help patients process trauma and emotional difficulties. Therapists trained in spatial psychology guided patients through exercises where they could literally reshape the space around them to represent and work through psychological challenges. A veteran suffering from PTSD might create spatial representations of battlefield memories, then systematically compress and dispel these dimensional constructs as part of their healing process. Educational applications expanded rapidly as teachers discovered that spatial manipulation could revolutionize learning. Students could literally step inside historical events through dimensional reconstructions, experience molecular interactions by manipulating space at the atomic level, or explore mathematical concepts by creating geometric shapes in three-dimensional space. The University of Cambridge reported that students using spatial learning techniques showed comprehension improvements of 243% compared to traditional teaching methods. Language acquisition took on new dimensions when students could create immersive environmental contexts for learning. A student studying Mandarin could compress space to connect their classroom directly to a marketplace in Beijing, allowing real-time conversation practice with native speakers. Similarly, medical students could create spatial passages into operating rooms at leading hospitals worldwide, observing procedures and techniques that would have been impossible to access through traditional educational methods. The entertainment industry underwent complete transformation as spatial manipulators became the new superstars of immersive media. Musicians created concerts where audience members could experience sound from inside the instruments themselves through spatial manipulation that allowed people to exist simultaneously within drums, guitars, and symphony orchestras. Movie theatres evolved into dimensional cinemas, where viewers could step directly into film narratives, experiencing stories from within the action, rather than as passive observers. Sports faced fundamental questions about fairness and competition when athletes with spatial manipulation abilities could alter the playing field itself. The International Olympic Committee spent 18 months developing new categories and regulations for spatial athletics. Traditional sports split into classical divisions for non-manipulators and dimensional leagues where spatial abilities were not just permitted but required. Basketball games became three-dimensional affairs where the court could expand, contract, or fold in on itself during play. Soccer matches evolved into complex geometric puzzles, where players could create shortcuts through bent space while defending against opponents who might compress the goal to make it effectively larger or smaller, depending on their team's needs. Professional leagues established strict testing protocols to ensure fair competition. The National Football League implemented spatial field generators that could detect and neutralize unauthorized dimensional manipulation during games. Baseball experimented with dimensionally dynamic stadiums, where the distance between bases could change throughout the game based on predetermined algorithms, creating strategy layers that required spatial awareness as much as traditional athletic ability. The art world experienced a renaissance as artists gained the ability to create works that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Sculptor Maria Santos gained international acclaim for her Impossible Monuments series, massive installations that occupied relatively small physical footprints, but contained vast interior spaces with intricate details that viewers could explore like architectural labyrinths. Her piece, Memory Palace, housed in a gallery space measuring only 10 square meters, contained over 47 rooms representing different aspects of human consciousness, each accessible through spatial passages that responded to viewers' emotional states. Writers began composing dimensional literature, stories that readers could physically enter and explore. Novelist John Patterson's breakthrough work, The Infinite Library, existed as both a traditional text and a vast dimensional space containing millions of books that readers could access through spatial manipulation. The work became a bestseller not for its narrative content, but for its revolutionary format that allowed readers to become active participants in the story's development by physically moving through its dimensional architecture. Architecture schools completely redesigned their curricula to incorporate spatial manipulation principles. The Bauhaus School in Germany, rebuilt after decades of abandonment, became the world's premier institution for dimensional architecture. Students learned to design buildings that could adapt their internal configurations based on occupant needs, environmental conditions, and even emotional atmospheres. Graduating architects created structures that challenged every assumption about interior and exterior space, public and private areas, and the relationship between form and function. The fashion industry embraced dimensional couture, clothing that existed in multiple spatial states simultaneously. Designer Isabella Rodriguez created dresses that appeared simple and elegant from the outside but contained vast interior spaces where the wearer could carry entire wardrobes, furniture, or even small vehicles. Her infinity handbag became a cultural phenomenon, a purse no larger than a traditional clutch that could accommodate virtually unlimited storage through compressed dimensional pockets. Environmental conservation efforts gained powerful new tools as spatial manipulators learned to create protected dimensional reserves for endangered species. The World Wildlife Fund established dimensional sanctuaries, spaces that existed outside normal geography, where threatened animals could thrive without human interference. A single dimensional preserve measuring 1 square kilometre in external dimensions could contain ecosystem areas equivalent to entire countries, providing habitat for thousands of species facing extinction in the traditional world. Climate change mitigation took on new possibilities as researchers developed techniques for sequestering atmospheric carbon in compressed dimensional spaces. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, an environmental physicist at the University of Cairo, pioneered methods for creating carbon sinks that existed in folded space, effectively removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere by storing them in alternate dimensions. His technique could process over 47 million tons of carbon dioxide annually, while occupying physical infrastructure no larger than a typical office building. Ocean cleanup projects leverage spatial manipulation to address the massive garbage patches floating in the world's seas. Environmental organizations created dimensional extraction systems that could isolate plastic pollution by folding it out of ocean water and into separate spaces for processing and recycling. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, estimated to contain over 80,000 metric tons of plastic waste, was reduced by 63% in just 14 months using these dimensional remediation techniques. Agricultural production expanded exponentially as farmers learned to create spatially enhanced growing environments. A single hectare of farmland could now contain the effective growing space of hundreds of hectares through careful spatial manipulation. Vertical farms evolved into dimensional farms where growing areas folded through multiple spatial layers, maximizing production while minimizing resource consumption. The Netherlands, despite its small geographic area, became the world's largest food exporter by cultivating crops in vast dimensional agricultural spaces that existed within traditional farm boundaries. Water scarcity issues found solutions through dimensional water transportation systems. Regions suffering from drought could access abundant water sources through spatial corridors that connected them to areas with water surpluses. The Sahara Desert began supporting large-scale agriculture through dimensional aqueducts that channeled water from the Congo River across thousands of kilometers of compressed space, effectively making the journey instantaneous and loss-free. Space exploration took on entirely new meanings when humans could manipulate space itself. The traditional approach of building rockets to traverse the vast distances between planets became obsolete as spatial manipulators learned to compress the space between Earth and other celestial bodies. The first human mission to Mars occurred not through a 9-month journey aboard a spacecraft, but through a dimensional corridor that reduced the 54.6 million kilometer distance to just a few steps through folded space. NASA's budget shifted from rocket development to spatial manipulation research. The agency recruited over 3,000 individuals with strong spatial abilities and established training facilities for dimensional astronauts, who could create stable corridors to other planets. The Mars Colonial Project, which had been estimated to require over $200 billion and decades of preparation using traditional space travel methods, achieved its first permanent settlement within 18 months, using spatial transportation at a cost of just $4.7 billion. Lunar mining operations became economically viable as spatial manipulation eliminated the traditional costs of launching materials and equipment into orbit. Mining companies could establish extraction facilities on the Moon and transport valuable materials directly to Earth processing centers through compressed space. The asteroid belt, previously accessible only through expensive robotic missions, became an active mining frontier as spatial manipulators created transportation networks that connected resource-rich asteroids directly to Earth-based refineries. The discovery that human minds could bend space ultimately revealed that consciousness itself was far more fundamental to reality than anyone had previously imagined. We weren't just observers of the universe, but active participants in its structure, capable of reshaping the very fabric of existence through focused intention and emotional energy. This realization forced humanity to reconsider every assumption about the nature of mind, matter, and the relationship between thought and reality. As months passed and spatial manipulation abilities became more widespread, affecting nearly 12% of the global population, it became clear that humanity was undergoing an evolutionary leap of unprecedented magnitude. We were becoming a species capable of transcending the limitations of three-dimensional space, of creating new realities through conscious intention, and of connecting distant parts of the universe through the power of focused thought. The implications stretched far beyond practical applications. If human consciousness could bend space, what other fundamental forces might yield to mental influence? Researchers began documenting cases of individuals who seemed capable of manipulating time as well as space, creating temporal loops and acceleration effects that suggested the boundaries between mind and the fundamental forces of physics were far more permeable than previously thought. The world had changed forever, not through external technological advancement, but through the awakening of capabilities that had perhaps always existed within human consciousness, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. As humanity adapted to this new reality, one thing became certain. We were no longer the same species that had looked up at the stars and wondered about our place in the cosmos. We had become beings capable of reshaping the cosmos itself, one thought, one intention, one bent space at a time.